Join me all throughout the weekend as we live stream all 3 XFL games taking place. And now, on with our feature presentation. December 31st, 2018. The Denver Broncos are one day removed from an ugly 23-9 loss at the hands of the Los Angeles Chargers, as their season has mercifully come to an end. Denver could not have ended the season any worse, as after a 2-0 start before scraping their way to 6-6 and an outside shot at the playoffs, they dropped their final 4 games to fall at 6-10, scoring under 17 points in all 4 games. It was another terrible season for Denver, as after going 5-11 in 2017, they had yet another losing record this year. For the first time since 1972, they had back-to-back seasons with a losing record. For close to half a century, the Broncos were one of the model franchises of the NFL, consistently being a solid team that was in the playoff hunt. And in the rare case that they had an off year, they immediately bounced back to, at the very least, mediocrity. However, with the man that you've been watching this whole time, Vance Joseph, as the head coach, the standard had fallen off. Denver went just 11-21 in his first 2 seasons there. And on New Year's Eve, the Broncos brass made the decision that there would not be a third, and that they were going to go in a different direction. Joseph obviously didn't want to be fired. He wanted one more chance to prove himself, saying after the loss to the Chargers, knowing that his seat was hot, "I want to be the head coach of this team. I would like to get a 3rd year. I think 2 years is just too short to judge a coach and a team." But John Elway thought otherwise, saying, "There's always going to be a high standard here. The bottom line is we need to win more football games." Just like that, Vance Joseph was out. His days in Colorado Rocky Mountain High were done. And while he would continue to coach and try and work his way up the ladder to maybe get a second shot at being a head coach, it wasn't going to be with the Denver Broncos. I'm sorry, what? He's back? He's back in Denver? For real? Yeah, that's kind of on the surface, isn't it? It's not even necessarily a knock on Joseph himself, even if his 4-year stint as Arizona's defensive coordinator yielded, shall we say, mixed results. But to be back with the team that fired you, and to be back in a lesser role? Just think about it in real life. Imagine if you got fired from your job, and then, 4 years later, you were rehired, but in a lesser role than where you were at when you got fired. The whole hierarchy and chain of command would be weird, wouldn't it? Instead of you being the one that employees report to, and you being the one giving the orders, you're now the one that has to report to them, and have to do as they say. It feels bizarre. Imagine if Mike Richards got rehired by Jeopardy, but this time, he's not the executive producer, but rather, he's a camera operator. Imagine if Bob Chapek got rehired by Disney, but this time, he's not the CEO, but rather, he's the monorail driver. There are players on the Broncos, like wide receiver Courtland Sutton and wide receiver Tim Patrick, who were on the Broncos in 2018 when Joseph was the head coach. And now, Joseph is back, but he's not the guy that's calling the shots. And if this feels weird to you that Joseph is back, you're not alone. Granted, there are some people that think this can work. Cornerback Chris Harris, who played 9 seasons with the Broncos and played under Joseph, said, "I always liked him. Cornerback Patrick Surtain will love him and play great under him. He'll be great for what they need, and he'll give defensive backs a chance to make plays. If he does well, he'll get a chance to be a head coach again." But while I don't want to say that something like this is unprecedented, because it's not, it's almost unprecedented, and it's extremely rare. In fact, in the post-merger era, so from 1970 to present, and in the last half-century, Joseph becomes just the 5th person ever to be the head coach of a team, get fired by that team, and then assume a coordinator position later with that team. There are some that assume lower roles than that. Tom Cable was the head coach of the Oakland Raiders from 2008 to 2010, then became the offensive line coach of the team from 2018 to 2021. Bill Johnson was the head coach of the Cincinnati Bengals from 1976 to 1978, and then became the tight ends coach from 1985 to 1990. Heck, Dom Capers is back in Carolina as a senior defensive assistant after being the team's first head coach ever from 1995 to 1998. But Joseph becomes just the fifth person to take this demotion of sorts at the coordinator level. Which got me to thinking, historically speaking, is there any correlation whatsoever to whether or not this can work with the limited sample size that we have? And of course, on this channel, whenever there's something that piques my curiosity and it has to do with both the NFL today and the NFL back in the day, you know I have to take a look at it. With that, I got to work. I looked at every single head coach in NFL history to then assume a coordinator position later on with that same team. So they're going back to that same environment, but they're in a lesser role. I'm not looking at guys to do this with position coach roles, because even though there are some other people to do this, like Dave Campo with the Cowboys in the secondary from 2008 to 2011, after being the head coach from 2000 to 2002, and Jim Dooley with the Bears as an offensive consultant from 1981 to 1989, after being the head coach from 1968 to 1971, their roles are very limited. And there's no real way to quantify their success in the same way that you can do with a coordinator, when they're in charge of a full unit. And it begs the question, were any of these coordinators who were a head coach in that same environment in the past any good? Well, let's find out. Again, not counting interim head coaches, Joseph is the fifth guy in the post-merger era to do this. The first one was Marion Campbell with the Atlanta Falcons, who I've talked about before on this channel for just how bad of a head coach he was, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. After serving as the head coach of the Falcons from the end of the 1974 season, when Norm Van Brocklin got fired, up until the midway point of 1976, thanks to compiling an abysmal record of 6-20, the Swamp Fox assumed the defensive coordinator role with the Philadelphia Eagles, and was the architect behind a defense that finished inside the top 10 in points allowed in 5 consecutive seasons, and was number 1 in the league in 1980, when they made it to their first Super Bowl in franchise history, and in 1981. He left the Eagles before the end of the 1985 season due to a poor head coaching stint there, but he returned to Atlanta to become the defensive coordinator under Dan Henning in 1986. As for how this return worked, well, it was amazing. In 1985, the year before Campbell got there, the Falcons' defense was abysmal. They allowed 452 points, which was dead last in the league. Seeing as the Falcons played 16 games that season, how many points per game is that? Let's divide 452 and 16, and oh my god, are you actually kidding me? I'm so sorry. I am so sorry, Falcons fans. How does this keep happening? Anyways, prior to Campbell's arrival, Atlanta's defense was usually atrocious, as out of 28 teams, they ranked 21st or worst in 4 consecutive seasons, and didn't have a season where they were in the top half of the league since 1980. But in Campbell's time as the defensive coordinator in 1986, they were ranked number 6. They only allowed 17.5 points per game, which is funny, because they allowed 280 points that season and scored 280, so it was perfectly balanced. Only 4 times did they allow more than 20 points in the game that year, and they held the vaunted San Francisco 49ers offense to just 30 points total over the 2 meetings. It was Atlanta's best defensive season in years, and the first time they weren't a joke on that side of the ball. Granted, Campbell became the head coach again in 1987 for some reason, and that was a disaster. But in terms of his job as a coordinator, in his 1 season there, this was a success. The next guy to do this is actually the only guy to do it on the offensive side of the ball, and that's Jim Ringo. Oddly enough, this is not the first time I've done a video on Ringo, as if you want to learn more about his disastrous head coaching stint in Buffalo from 1976 to 77, when he went 3-20 and quit the team in the middle of a game, click the card in the upper right corner. However, after getting fired as their head coach and bouncing around the league in various offensive roles, mainly as an offensive line coach, he returned to Buffalo in 1985 to serve as their offensive coordinator, serving for 4 seasons there until his retirement after the 1988 season. As for his time as Buffalo's offensive coordinator after he returned, well, it wasn't great. It's pretty telling that after 1988, Buffalo's offense was one of the best in football, finishing inside the top 3 of the league in points scored in 4 straight seasons from 1989 to 1992. But while Ringo was there, it was pretty stagnant. The best that Ringo's offense ever did with the Bills was in 1988, when they were 14th in points scored. But even then, their offense was wildly inconsistent, as they had 4 games where they were held to single-digit points, including a game against a really bad Tampa Bay Buccaneers team where they were held to 5 points. Again, that was his best season in terms of total offense and points scored. They were dead last in 1985, 20th in 1986, and 24th in 1987. When Mark Gibrota assumed the offensive coordinator role in 1989, it felt in many ways like addition by subtraction. So this one was not a success. Next up, we go back to the defensive side of the ball and go to the AFC West to focus on Gunther Cunningham. If you want to learn more about his coaching career and his original stint as the head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs, click the card in the upper right corner. Cunningham struggled as Kansas City's head coach, as after a solid decade of consistent success under Marty Schottenheimer, the Chiefs went just 16-16 in his 2 seasons there from 1999 to 2000, and lost 6 of their final 8 games to cap off the 2000 season. However, after being on Jeff Fisher's staff in Tennessee for 3 seasons, he returned to Kansas City and served as the team's defensive coordinator for 5 seasons from 2004 to 2008. The results were mixed. In his 5 seasons there, the Chiefs had a defense that finished inside the top half of the league 3 times, albeit never inside the top 10, and had a defense that finished 29th, so 4th from the bottom, 2 times. And in all 5 seasons that he was in charge of the defense, one of the staples was a porous run defense. His defenses could never stop the ground game. In terms of yards per carry allowed, the Chiefs ranked 29th in 2004, 20th in 2005, which was their best season, 21st in 2006, 25th in 2007, and 31st in 2008. Teams could run on the Chiefs at will if they wanted to. Case in point, the game against the Chargers in 2006 where they lost 20-9 because the Chargers had 265 rushing yards, and LaDainian Tomlinson had 199 yards by himself. I call this one a failure of sorts. And finally, the last team to actually do this was none other than the Denver Broncos, when Wade Phillips, after being the head coach of the team from 1993 to 1994, and going 16-16 before being fired from Mike Shanahan, returned to Denver to become the team's defensive coordinator in 2015. Granted, this one's a bit different than the others, because an entire generation had passed. Everyone who played for Phillips in Denver was retired by this point. Heck, it wasn't even the same facility. They had a brand new stadium. However, to say that Phillips' short stint in Denver was a success would be a massive understatement, because after finishing 22nd in defense in 2013 and 16th in 2014, Phillips came in and was the mastermind behind what many consider to be one of the greatest defenses of the 21st century. You could put this as a top 5 defense of the last 20 years, and not many people would bat an eye. Without Phillips, especially since that offense with Brock Osweiler and the corpse of Peyton Manning was terrible, it's unlikely that the Broncos are even close to a Super Bowl winning team. In his 2 seasons as Denver's defensive coordinator, the Broncos were 4th in points allowed, and in 2015, the defense was number 1 in total yards allowed, number 1 in passing yards, number 1 in passing yards per attempt, and number 1 in rushing yards per attempt. Perhaps no game exhibited this more than Super Bowl 50, when they completely shut down the Carolina Panthers and MVP quarterback Cam Newton while forcing 4 turnovers. Phillips is one of the greatest defensive coordinators of all time, and this stint in Denver in the mid-2010s was yet another shining example of why he earned that reputation. So we've got 4 examples all time of this happening, with 2 success stories and 2 failures. So the evidence isn't convincing either way. There's no precedent to say that the Broncos hiring Vance Joseph back is going to be a success, and there's no precedent to say that it will be a failure. It depends. I guess the only argument you could make is that Campbell and Phillips are some of the greatest coordinators of all time, while Ringo and Cunningham didn't exactly have impressive coordinator resumes before coming back. And Joseph falls into that second category rather than the first. But still, it is inconclusive either way. Having said that, even though the Vance Joseph head coaching experiment didn't work out, if he can lead Denver's defense, redeem his reputation with the Broncos, and get them back to the playoffs for the first time since 2015, then he'll have the time of his life. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.